Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever noticed how many people seem worried about climate change, but then you rarely hear anyone actually talking about it? It's like a silent agreement not to discuss it, and a new study from the Netherlands is digging into why. So, the big question here is about this strange social phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. Basically, it means we all think most other people don't care about something, when in reality lots of them actually do. The researchers in this study wondered if this is happening with climate change. Are people thinking that not many others care about climate change, making them less likely to talk about it or act on it themselves? And what's really going on when people do talk about climate change? Especially with friends and family, this study aimed to find out. In simple terms, they surveyed a bunch of people in the Netherlands, almost 1,000 of them, to get a good picture of what most people think. They found that most people don't talk about climate change very often, maybe just once a month or even less. And get this, they discovered that people were actually underestimating how much others cared about climate change. This is the pluralistic ignorance part. They also looked at whether talking about climate change made people more likely to do good things for the environment. Things we call pro-environmental behavior or PEB. The scientists know climate change is a huge deal, and most people are worried, but for some reason not enough is being done. They think that a big part of the problem might be that we think others aren't as concerned as we are. This makes us quiet, and that silence makes the problem seem even bigger. It's like a vicious cycle. They specifically wanted to see if this pluralistic ignorance, this mistaken belief about what others think, was a barrier to talking about climate change and taking action. So, how did they investigate this? Well, they conducted a survey with a representative group of people from the Netherlands. Think of it as a really good snapshot of the whole country. They asked people about their own worries and feelings about climate change, and then they asked them to guess what the average person in the Netherlands thought about climate change. This comparison is key to measuring pluralistic ignorance. They also asked people how often they talked about climate change with different groups of people like family, friends, and colleagues. And finally, they measured what kind of actions people were actually taking to help the environment, like how often they ate meat or whether they reduced their plane travel. They even looked at a smaller group of climate change communication experts, people who are trained to facilitate these conversations, to see if their perspectives differed. They got a solid number of responses, over 900 people. And this group was carefully selected to represent the Dutch population across things like age, gender, and education. This means their findings are likely to be quite reliable for the country as a whole. Let's break down what they measured. For climate change concern, they asked about importance, worry, and personal responsibility. Then, to see if there was pluralistic ignorance, they asked people to estimate how important climate change was to the majority of people, how worried the majority was, and how responsible the majority felt. The difference between what people felt themselves and what they thought the majority felt is where they found their pluralistic ignorance. For communication, they asked about frequency of talking with different groups, how much they enjoyed these talks, and even how often they heard others talking about it. And for pro-environmental behavior, they looked at things like eating less meat, driving less, flying less, and actions like signing petitions or donating to environmental groups. Now, for the number crunching, they used statistical tests to see if people were underestimating the concern of others. Think of a p-value like a fluke-o-meter. If the p-value is really low, it means the result is probably not just a random chance occurrence. They also used more advanced math called regression analyses to see how all these different factors like pluralistic ignorance and communication frequency related to people's environmental actions. They were careful to adjust their tests to avoid finding things by chance, especially since they were looking at several different environmental behaviors. Okay, so what did they find? First, the communication aspect. They confirmed that most people in the Netherlands talk about climate change quite infrequently. For partners, it was a bit more, but with friends and family, it was mostly described as occasionally. And with acquaintances and strangers, even less. Here's the really interesting part about pluralistic ignorance. They found strong evidence for it. People consistently underestimated how important climate change was to others, how worried others were, and how much responsibility others felt. For example, the average person estimated that others felt less responsible for climate change than they actually did this. Underestimation was quite significant. And even among the climate communication experts who talk about this stuff a lot, they still showed some signs of pluralistic ignorance. Although they were more accurate about others' worry than the general public. This figure really highlights it. The dotted lines show the actual average concern in the sample, and the lighter bars show what people thought the average was. You can see the gaps, with the thought bars mostly lower than the actual bars, especially for responsibility. Now, for the big question, does underestimating others' concern lead people to do less for the environment? This is where it gets surprising. They hypothesized that higher pluralistic ignorance would negatively predict pro-environmental behavior, meaning more ignorance would lead to less action. But the results were the opposite. For meat-eating frequency, which is a personal behavior, they found that higher pluralistic ignorance was actually associated with lower meat-eating. That's right, the more people underestimated others' concern, the less meat they tended to eat. This goes against the idea that thinking nobody cares makes you act less. They also found something similar for motorized travel, where more underestimation meant less car use. For motorized travel, the results showed that pluralistic ignorance was a significant negative predictor. This means that people who underestimated how much others cared about climate change actually made less use of motorized transport. But it gets even more interesting when they looked at public sphere PEB, like signing petitions or donating to environmental groups. Here, higher pluralistic ignorance was a significant positive predictor. The more people underestimated others' concern, the more likely they were to engage in these public actions. This is completely counter to the usual thinking that pluralistic ignorance leads to inaction. So, why this unexpected finding? The researchers suggest that maybe the common idea that pluralistic ignorance automatically leads to less pro-environmental behavior is not entirely accurate. At least when we look at actual behavior. Instead of making people feel like they don't need to act because others don't care, it might actually motivate some people to step up their own actions. Perhaps as a form of moral cleansing or to compensate, the study acknowledges that their data is correlational, meaning they can't definitively say one causes the other, but it challenges the idea that pluralistic ignorance is always a bad thing for individual action. They highlight that the empirical basis for the link between pluralistic ignorance and actual behavior is limited, with much of the research focusing on intentions or experimental tasks. Their findings suggest that for day-to-day behavior, underestimating others' concern might actually push people to act more. However, they also point out that even if it doesn't hurt individual action, pluralistic ignorance could still have downsides, like limiting people's willingness to take even more sustainable actions or hindering systemic change by reducing support for climate policies. What about communication? They found that hearing others talk about climate change was linked to less pluralistic ignorance. This makes sense. The more you hear about it, the more realistic your view of others' concern might become. However, talking mostly with people who already share your opinion, what they call like-minded interaction, actually predicted higher levels of pluralistic ignorance. This could be because people are getting stuck in epistemic bubbles, where they only hear confirming views and their misperceptions get reinforced. Looking at this table, you can see that hearing others talk about climate change more often was associated with lower pluralistic ignorance levels. But on the flip side, talking to others who share one's opinion was associated with higher pluralistic ignorance. Interestingly, while climate change conversations didn't directly boost individual actions like eating less meat, they did positively predict public sphere PEB, like signing petitions. This suggests that talking about climate change might make people more aware of opportunities for collective action and encourage them to participate in ways that benefit the environment on a larger scale. So, what's the big takeaway from this study? First, most adults in the Netherlands understand climate change is real and are concerned, but they still talk about it pretty infrequently. This infrequent communication might be a barrier to societal change. Second, and this is the really surprising part, pluralistic ignorance underestimating how much others care doesn't seem to be a universal brake on pro-environmental action. In some cases, it was even linked to more sustainable behavior. This challenges the common narrative and suggests we need to be more nuanced in how we think about social norms and climate action. The researchers are upfront about some limitations. They mentioned that some questions might have been a bit complex, and the translation of the survey might have made some parts sound a bit translated, potentially confusing participants. They also focused mainly on in-person conversations and didn't delve deeply into the impact of traditional media or social media exposure. Future research could explore these communication channels more and refine the measurement of pluralistic ignorance with simpler questions. This is a really fascinating study because it flips a common assumption on its head. We often hear that the key to climate action is getting everyone to realize that most people care, and that tackling pluralistic ignorance will unlock behavior change. But this study suggests that for some people and for some types of actions, the reverse might be true. When you feel like you're doing more than others because you think they don't care, it might actually give you the motivation to keep going or even do more, especially for things like signing petitions. However, it is crucial to remember the author's point about the limitations. This is a snapshot, and we can't say for sure that pluralistic ignorance causes increased PEB. Maybe people who are already motivated to act are the ones who also underestimate others' concern. Or maybe there is another factor altogether. Also, while it might not hinder individual actions, that underestimation could still be a problem for getting widespread political or systemic change. If people believe decision makers are afraid of backlash because they think the public isn't behind climate action, those leaders might be less likely to push for bold policies. This research opens up so many questions, it makes me wonder, should we stop trying to tell people that everyone cares, or should we be more strategic about which types of conversations we encourage? Perhaps focusing on public-facing actions and acknowledging that sometimes feeling like you are ahead of the curve can be a motivator is a more useful approach. It definitely suggests we need more research to understand these complex relationships and develop more effective communication strategies. What do you all think? Have you noticed this silence around climate change? And does this finding about pluralistic ignorance surprise you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into social psychology and climate action, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more insights, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thanks for watching.